Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and my partner, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello.
And you are not the only person in yellow today, because we have also got the one and only Laura McInerney. Hello, Laura.
Hello.
Oh, it's so great to have you on our podcast. You're someone that I just think is an exciting person to speak to, and you've got so much to talk about, and we're going to ask you all kinds of questions. So warm welcome to our podcast. I'm going to kick off by asking you.
Well, no, I'm going to stop first because I want to talk about these drums.
Okay, no.
Right? So for those who are listening and can't see this, in the background here, I have a set of drums, electric drums. And for the last 2 years in the pandemic, I've been outed as a drummer on BBC News. Presenters have made comments about this. I've had to do very serious business meetings. And these drums are all Tom's fault because he sold them to me a few years ago. But it's great because now I tell everybody that I bought drums from Tom Sherrington and they think I'm really cool. So I'm super excited to be here and to show you that I do actually use these drums.
No, it's great. It's great to see them again. I remember bringing them back. And we did the deal when we both went to see Richard Ashcroft in concert. That was quite
exactly, because again, if listeners don't know, Tom taught Richard Ashcroft from the band The Verve, which is like super cool. So I got to go to see a Richard Ashcroft concert with you and have your drums in my house. It's like edu celeb awesomeness all round.
It was all very exciting. Yeah, I mean the Verve thing is quite crazy because they were just students. Like there were lots of student bands, and I had this amazing thing that they had a recording studio, and no one really knew how to use it. So I kind of got involved, and they lots of schools have like sixth formers in lunchtime bands, and they were just in one of them. And I recorded this song of theirs called Documentary when he was about 17. And at the end of it, I've got a tape of it. And at the end of it, he says, "That was quite excellent, lads."
Can't believe you have a tape of it. Why isn't it on eBay, Tom? Go to the highest bidder.
I've put it out. There's a blog I have written about this, and that you can listen to the song. It's actually pretty good, I have to say.
You so need to put it out again. And and you need to also make some kind of little audio clip with "That was quite excellent, lads." And actually and keep playing.
So we could talk all evening about Richard Ashcroft and our sort of mutual love of him. Although I have to admit, he's been a bit sort of weirdly anti-masky in COVID. So he's gone down a bit in my estimation. But anyway, so Laura, I mean, you've had this amazing career. I mean, you're someone who, you started off, you're one of the early pioneers of Teach First. You were a teacher of citizenship, which is, not everyone teaches citizenship, and that you've always been, banging the drum for that. You were the editor of Schools Week right from the beginning, which is just epic in itself. And now you said, this is a phenomenal thing. Teacher Tapp. So, let's tell people, I mean, I've just given a synopsis there, but do you feel like you're a teacher at heart and that has moved on? Or do you feel now you're some sort of ed tech entrepreneur? How do you feel about your professional world?
Not sure I'm ever going to feel like a tech bro. When I do sit in tech bro conversations, it's always a bit like, take your cap off and put your feet down off the table. I think the teacher in me overrides everything. But I think there's a golden thread that runs through a lot of this, which is that I just believe in information. I believe that knowing stuff can help you feel more confident, can help you help other people. And it's really fundamental to a society flourishing. And I was a citizenship teacher, in part because I did a degree that had a mixture of subjects in it that didn't lend itself very easily at that time to being a core subject teacher. Pre-2009, you see, you had to have a degree in the subject that you taught. And I didn't easily have it. So citizenship was the thing that we all got flung into in Teach First. After 2009, you were allowed to teach things that you had an A-level in. So I'd have probably become an English or a maths teacher, and maybe I'd have felt equally passionate about those subjects. But when I got there with citizenship, I really do believe that young people have to learn the instrument of making change. When I was doing my A-levels, they tried to close the college down halfway through the first year. And so I remember going to the library, because there's no internet back then, and digging out all of these select committee reports and looking through education white papers to find the reasons why they said the school was closing, the policy and what the policy's original intentions were, and writing to the radio and writing to our MP. And we managed to get the college open for 1 extra year so that those of us in our second year could finish our A-levels. And I used to show that letter to my students and say, you know, the reason we did this was because we figured out who to write to. We were able to write, we were able to put our point forwards, and you have to learn that stuff. And I was lucky, I have a dad who was always involved in the trade union movement, is a local councillor now, my mum's a local councillor. So I had that in my house all the time, but other people don't. So I was passionate about citizenship teaching. And then really Schools Week and Teacher Tapp, they just follow the same trajectory. Schools Week was how can you get into the hands of teachers every week the news that matters of what's happening all across the sector, whether that's politicians, whether it's decisions that's being made, whether it's Ofqual and Ofsted. You've got to have somebody who's ringing them up in the week and giving them a bit of a hard time and asking for answers and getting those answers. Because when you're a school leader, if you phone the DFE, you'll get a response that says, oh, we'll get back to you in 15 days. 15 days is the service level response from the DFE most of the time, right? And you're trying to make a decision in an hour. Whereas when we rang up, because there's only a few newspapers and there's a lot of press officers, you get an answer within 30 minutes and you can get it out onto Twitter. So for me, it was the same as in citizenship. It was what information do people need on the ground so they can make better decisions. And then Teacher Tapp, which is this daily survey app. We now have about 7,500 teachers who answer on a daily basis. Obviously, many more across a week are on it, and about 30-odd thousand have it on their phones. That gives quick polls so we can find what's happening on the ground in schools and often get that in front of policymakers, education decision makers, education organisations. But more importantly, the app shares the results back. So on the ground in the school, you can learn what's happening in other schools, what do other teachers think and what do they do. So you can also either change your practice, change jobs. I've had teachers who found out that other schools were getting free tea and coffee, go into their head teachers and show them the app. And say, you said the tax man said we can't have free tea and coffee, but it turns out 55% of schools can, so we want it too.
Well, let's have a look. I mean, honestly, I mean, Emma, we're all bursting to ask you questions. But the Teacher Tapp thing,
Shut up.
Teacher Tapp is amazing. I mean, it's we could talk to you about so many things you've done before, but let's just really explore this because it's become a real thing, hasn't it? And it's 7,500. That's just really incredible. And I remember going to a thing where you were sort of testing it out, and it's upgraded so many times. It looks amazing now. But you, just like today, you have the results of yesterday's poll, and it says the current accountability measures are a fair and accurate way to measure school performance, and 1% strongly agree, and 17% somewhat agree. So it's only 18% of people are sort of broadly positive about the current, and then 32% somewhat disagree, 23% strongly disagree. There's a lot, you know, it gives you a feeling of the spread, but what it tells you is not everyone hates the accountability system. So it's like it gives you the nuance there, and of course you can track that over time. It's just phenomenal. It's so interesting. And then another one about external assessments. So the different questions. So I'm so interested in this. What's the source of these questions? You know, why have you asked those questions yesterday, for example?
Sure. So there are different types of questions on the app. We do allow some people to commission surveys with us. So we sort of work a bit like YouGov as a polling organisation where they ask lots about politics, lots of different things. We do that, but specifically for schools, especially because you've got to speak the language of education, I think, a lot of the time to be able to ask questions that teachers are interested in. And so we'll sometimes have commission surveys on there, and sometimes they're ours. Majority of them are actually ours. They are sent to us by people on Twitter. They are suggested to us by teachers as we go around the country. So yeah, be a bit careful. If you ever @Teacher Tapp with a question, 3 days later, it may well pop up. People are always surprised, and then they're tweeting, oh my goodness, you really did ask our question. We don't say in advance which questions have been commissioned and which haven't, because we think that could bias the results. And also we're really careful about how you ask the questions. So we have like an editorial process internally to try and get rid of as much bias as possible. We won't let people ask lots and lots of questions. So people come and they want to find a particular answer. And we say to them, we're not the organization for that. If you want to find out the real answer, we'll help you come up with a question for that. And so because of that, we consider every question that's on there a Teacher Tapp question. Sometimes they've been suggested by different people. And after 6 months, we always say to people that do commission the surveys, we retain the right after 6 months to use that information and to share it as much as possible. So we're slowly building up a bank of research and evidence over what is now 4.5 years of everything, and we can share that as we wish back with the community in time. So the Commission Surveys funds it, everybody gets to learn, and over time we're really starting to see some exciting trends, because we were asking questions in May 2018, May 2019 that we're now starting to ask again, and we can really compare exactly spring before the pandemic with spring after the pandemic to see how much things have changed.
So what's changed? What when you're looking at that data now, what's the thing that made you go, whoa, that's massive, or that's huge, or I didn't expect that?
One of the biggest changes we saw in the pandemic already, and I think it's going to bear out in the long term, is how much homework is changing. Homework has been a really big marking load for teachers, and I know it differs by subject and key stage and everything else. But marking is something that nobody likes. When you poll teachers and you say, what's the favourite part of your job? Writing lessons, delivering lessons, or marking? 0% of teachers select marking, right? And what we've seen is that the technologies that were brought in during the pandemic, a lot of it being online assessment that can be automated, assessment that the students can do themselves, and then the questions or the answers, the results are delivered to the teachers. That seems incredibly popular and very likely to stay, which should start to reduce now the marking workload. So we're just rerunning it. We're also not seeing as much change on the technology front as I expected. So how many teachers have a school laptop, for example, didn't change that much between the beginning and the end of the pandemic, which I'm really surprised by. And again, we're just tracking and looking now to see how much student access to devices has changed, because obviously more schools will have bought laptops for every child. And I think we're going to see it move a bit, but probably not as much as I would have expected, given in April 20, May 2020, exactly how much of a focus there was on technology.
I think the results that you get on Teacher Tapp, I mean, I don't know how much feedback you get on how people then use them, but I know that I use them an awful lot. And one of the Teacher Tapp surveys that I go back to again and again was the one where you asked about, where do you see yourself in 10 years? Which role do you see yourself? And the difference between men and women who saw themselves as a head teacher and who didn't see themselves as a head teacher. So do you find that there are things that come out of the questions that you ask that you weren't actually asking about, but then they are kind of huge provocations on the back of it?
Yeah, all of the time, and things that are a surprise. So we put a question in thinking it will go in one direction and it goes in the other. A couple of weeks ago, the government put out a white paper and talked about the parent pledge, and we asked how much people supported the parent pledge. Now, often people think teachers are super anti-government, and actually the majority, I think it was over 60% of teachers were in support of what had been said. And people were quite angry at us for this, and sort of sometimes on Twitter they'll accuse me of being in the pockets of the government or something. But actually I was really surprised. I thought people were going to say they didn't like it, and then they do, and that's just the way that it is. I mean, the government didn't influence them, we asked it.
Wasn't that the parent pledge though that was just like basic common sense, like be nice to children, teach them stuff?
It's yeah, tell parents if their children are falling behind in English and maths and do something about it. And we also discovered in the next question, 87% of primary schools already do all of this.
Yeah, that's what
secondary schools actually, though, again, surprised me. In secondary schools, how many people said they didn't do this? And in part, it's because what counts as behind? Actually, in year 8, what is the concept of behind? And I think secondary schools don't really like that language of behind, because by then we're just labelling children. Your son or daughter is likely to get X grade, a 3 or a 4. We don't talk about above, below, behind, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting that I think the government have told people to do something when they might not actually want those children to be labelled as behind. And the reason schools don't do it is actually quite a good reason. So all the time we get these findings that we don't expect. And to come back to you on the women and men of the head of what would you expect of yourself in 10 years time, would you like to be a head teacher? Not only do we find that women are much further behind in how much they think they're going to become a head teacher, but also that secondary female teachers, it's a very, very low percentage. In primary, it's much higher. It's about 9% of women. But men in primary schools, 20-odd% of them, I think it was 23% think they're going to become head teachers. You'll notice that better than me, probably. So it is extraordinary. And there are things to do there in the system, as you say, to address now, because we know there's such a difference. And when I hear stories like yours of, right, that stays with me, I think about that and I share that with other people, then that's how we know we've done our job.
And it's the slide, whenever I put it up, you know, when working with like trusts and CEOs and head teachers, it's always the one that gets the audible gasp, like, I can't believe it's that stark. So it's so useful to be able to capture that information, to share in kind of different niche networks across the sector, to actually start to make actionable change. It's so powerful, I think. So thank you.
I can come back as well on Tom with the accountability.
Yeah.
One of the things we do every week on Teacher Tapp, so if people haven't been on it before, you download it, it's free from the App Store. And then once you're signed up, you get the questions each day. But we also once a week do a weekly blog where we then break down this kind of stuff. So men versus women. And on accountability, we do find quite a big difference sometimes, depending on what the accountability metric is and your job role. So for example, Ofsted is something that head teachers tend to be much more negative towards, but actually classroom teachers more positive than I would have expected compared to heads, in part because for them it's accountability on their senior managers who they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have any kind of power or influence over. So it is really interesting, but it sometimes challenges our own perceptions, especially when we are in a role or a part of the country or a certain gender and we're not used to hearing the other side of the opinions of it.
That's one of the things I think is so important. It's sort of it strikes me every time. I mean, in nearly every survey you do, there are responses in every category. So it shows you that, and it's of course about the relative proportions of them. So sometimes people are going, who are the 2% who think this? And everyone's outraged. You think, well, you know, why would you expect there to be nobody? You know, that people, and I sometimes catch myself out like that. So one of the things I know is I've heard you sort of, well, I've seen you on Twitter kind of defend this, if that's the right word, sort of, you'll get challenged a little bit about skew and representation. But I mean, my understanding is that a sample of 7,500 people is pretty big in polling terms. But is it representative of the profession? What's your sense of that?
Sure. So we've always felt it would be a bit skewed, especially because when we launched in 2017, we launched at the Research Ed conference. So our first 1,000 people really were either at that conference or friends of people at that conference through word of mouth. And then over the years, we've obviously grown and we keep a check on how different the people are who signed up at the beginning versus the sample as it's changed. And you can see, for example, when we ask about interest in research, how often you read certain books, certain concepts, that the people at the beginning were more skewed. But as the samples got bigger, as more people hear of us through word of mouth and as that network is larger, it's less skewed. Now, every survey has a problem in that the only people in it are the people who responded to the survey. So unless you make it absolutely mandatory, I don't know, you can fine people if they're not in it. You're always going to have some people who don't answer. So we can't say that it's perfectly representative of everyone. But the thing we do, which is important, is we reweight the data. So we use the workforce census, which is taken from information that schools send to the government. And that shows you what the population of teachers look like on observable characteristics. For example, gender, how many men and women are there? How many people are in primary and secondary school? How many people are a classroom teacher or a head teacher? And then when we get our sample together, we reweight the results so that they are representative of that. So if we had lots more women than we should have had in the sample, we slightly reweight it. We give the men a little bit extra in terms of the weight of the results. And that makes it more representative. And one of the ways we can check this, of course, is other people do surveys. And a really simple one is we ask about voting intentions. And we've had a couple of general elections in the time we've been going, because those things move quite quickly in this country now. And we've come in almost on the nose each time with when they've done follow-up surveys and looked at teachers particularly, on the nose of what you would expect. We will also sometimes rerun surveys that are done by the Department for Education on very big samples to see what we come in with. And I'm always surprised how close we come. It's 1 or 2% on the overalls. And then once you start getting into smaller groups, so if we start to look at, I don't know, male secondary teachers, male science teachers in academies, then your margin of error gets much bigger, maybe 5 or 6%. But overall, we're within 1 or 2% almost all of the time. And the times when I've been convinced we did something wrong and our data is wrong, it's always that I have forgotten something. Maths is better than me, it turns out. Statistics are better than I am. It's that my logic, usually there's a group of people that I've forgotten about. And a classic example was on photocopying. Years ago, one of the ministers had a go at schools over colour photocopying and how they were allowing everybody to do colour photocopying. And I tweeted, you know, he needs his head testing, no one does this. And I got 56 likes and I was dead excited. And then we put it on Twitter, on Teacher Tapp. And the next day I found out loads of schools had colour photocopying, because I'd completely forgotten, and Emma's nodding, I'd completely forgotten primary schools, because I am a secondary teacher who mainly hangs out with secondary people. And even though I know I shouldn't forget primary, right? I try really hard not to forget primary. It was such a classic slip. It happens all the time. So when people have a go at skew, I understand it. I'm often afraid we're skewed. I often think we are. And then I remember that, yeah, maths is just better than me.
Well, it's good.
Sorry, I was just want to ask, do you have a typical teacher tapper? It's like, who's your biggest group? What's your, like, tapper?
Yeah, so we've been overrepresented. That means we have more than we should have in the population, typically, of male secondary maths teachers and heads of departments.
I knew you were going to say.
Obviously, we're a data platform. I mean, that's not entirely a surprise, right? No. But I will also give us this. We have remodeled the app in the last 18 months or so. And our new community manager, who just joined us this month, is called Sushana Sandal. And Sushana was a primary teacher previously, because I need somebody to make sure that the primary and the whole primary crowd are being asked really relevant questions, and that it speaks to a broad group. But it's hard, you know, it's really hard. Teachers, as you said before, are very diverse. It seems like it's a simple job. And then you ask people these questions and you look at the data and you realise there's almost nothing similar about being an art teacher for GCSE and A-level students compared to being a year 3 teacher. Like, there's nothing similar about those jobs. And so we talk as though teachers are homogenous and they're very diverse, but we're doing our best to get a broad range of people in, speak to a broad range, and definitely work more on primary.
No, it's interesting. And there's so much to, I think obviously the educational issues that you're talking about are probably the most important thing, but I sort of feel there's so much, I'm fascinated in the way that you sort of tried to tap into, to a bit of a, to use a phrase, the psychology of teachers and that kind of streak motor mentality. And I must admit, it vexes me. On my Teacher Tapp, if I look at my badges, the only one that's any good is the fact that I have been on Teacher Tapp for 1,685 days.
That's the maximum possible. I think you got in like the day before, didn't you? Before it even launched.
I was right on day one, but my current streak is only 1. And it's partly because I'm terribly demotivated every time I lose a streak. And I just think, oh, what's the point? And it takes me ages to get back into being bothered. It's a bit like with Wordle. If I lost my Wordle streak, I nearly cried for about 2 days. And then now I sort of don't care anymore, because what's the point? So do you feel like this sort of streaking and the kind of the keeping going is a factor, or do you think people kind of come and go now and it doesn't matter so much?
Well, we've got data. We've looked at this a lot. So we know that when we did introduce the streaks and the badges, it definitely did lift the number of people who were what we would call everyday tappers, which is the majority of our users. People typically, if they're on it pretty much every day. And so it does have that effect. We also know from the number of people who contact us, by far the thing they contact us most about is their loss of streaks. And we're very happy, you know, if something's happened to your phone or you've gone and got married for the day, like give us a message, we'll connect your streak up. It's fine, right? Like the world is going to be okay if you get your streak back. We have put lifelines in. So a lot of the time people are able to win their badges back. And we want to look again, now the app's been redone, is there anything else we can do to help with that? So could it be over time, perhaps if you've answered so many questions, you can bank a lifeline and then bring it back again? Because we want to gamify it and make it fun, but we don't want to demotivate people. The thing is, it makes a big difference to us and the data's completeness if we're able to have all of the information, because if we can have you answer that question in, say, 2018, 2019 and 2020, that helps us track a lot of the variables. We can do it with the whole sample, that's fine, and somebody else can kind of take your place, but it's really helpful where we've got complete data on a respondent to be able to track it over time. So that's why we want to incentivize people to be there every single day. It's not just about the game.
So have you started tapping again, Tom? Are you back on?
Yeah. Well, it's just,
I'm worried about this now.
No, I mean, the thing is, for me, I have to say this, so you can either persuade me or not, this right now is, as someone who's no longer a teacher, although used to be, a lot of the questions I have to tap not relevant. And so that also I find a little bit like, therefore, that a bit to me suggests it doesn't matter. So am I wrong about that? Because if it matters to you that my not relevance are still counted, then I'll do it. But if it doesn't sort of matter, then it doesn't really matter if I tap or not. So that's my feeling about that.
With the greatest respect and admiration for you, Tom, I'm afraid it sort of doesn't matter. In that if you're not a teacher, we allow people who are not a teacher to be on the app because we hope that people are interested in the results, and it might be that you want to look at the results. She said before, Amanda Spielman has said she's very interested in what's happening in the teaching profession. So she is on Teacher Tapp so that she can look and see how the teaching profession feels, including on questions about Ofsted. But her results aren't going to be added in to what we do and our research, right? So when you see those weekly blogs, we're removing the people who are not teachers because they're not the people whose voices are on the ground who we want to reflect back up to government. So it's not that you don't matter in a great philosophical sense, it's just that in a research perspective, it doesn't matter that much.
Sort of, you know, give me like relevance in life. Sort of a generally existential kind of crisis there, but no, but that's important to know. So but
I wouldn't want you not to be on it if you find it interesting, which is why we created that route. And again, if anybody's listening who is a school governor or works in a school and isn't a teacher, is a teaching assistant, is a librarian, if they feel it would be interesting and they don't mind clicking not relevant, 100% take the route. But if you're dragging yourself through it only because you know that one not relevant is really important, then that's probably not the best reason why. What I will say, coming back to primary as well, is we don't have enough primary people. So each of those voices at the moment, we reweight to make sure they are balanced in the sample, but it would be good to have more primary teachers on, precisely so they can rebalance that secondary voice.
Every time I do primary training, I put Teacher Tapp on there. Every time.
Thanks, Emma.
A steadily growing number. Because like you say, it's really important. There's far more primary schools than there are secondary schools. Yes. I mean, the staffing are similar. But it's things like in headship, there are far more heads in primary schools than there are in secondary schools. So actually, when you're talking about running an organisation and running a school, there needs to be more representation from primary schools, simply because there are more people, especially in senior roles, than there are in secondary schools. So it's so important that primary kind of get their voices and their opinions captured, and Tom knows how I feel about the secondaryisation of primary schools anyway, so I shall leave that one there.
It happens all the time. I mean, I think that what you do is you create a vehicle for us to really have stuff reflected back to us, so that we avoid these sort of sweeping generalizations. You know, you get arguments which are played out on Twitter and elsewhere around, say, primary versus secondary, or early years is another category, and also people from different training routes. So my PGC versus other routes. And so do you feel like you're able to kind of finesse that? You know, do you feel like there are these patterns, primary versus secondary, or do you think within primary there's as much variation and of opinion as there is within secondary about certain things like assessment or curriculum?
So your classic centrist, it's all a bit more complex and nuanced than that kind of person. And unfortunately, sometimes the data doesn't agree with me. And actually, there are really very distinct differences. And the two don't always agree with each other particularly well. One of the classics on this is the prog versus trad debate, where I've always been like, everybody's a bit prog, everybody's a bit trad, whatever. And then actually you do find there are quite lots of people who say they are one more than the other. And then we start to look at traits in the classroom and whether you'd expect those to go with progs and trads, and it does get a bit more complicated. So people say they're one or the other, but on a day-to-day basis, they might actually act much more similar. So you have people who identify in different groups, but really they're much more similar than they believe. With primary and secondary, what we tend to find is if you ask about assessment, there are big differences, and particularly primary feel differently about secondary assessments and secondary feel differently about primary assessments. It's interesting how much secondary schools say they don't trust SAT scores, for example. They don't trust things from the primary school, and yet they'll happily set year 7 using those SAT scores. So primary teachers kind of can't win. And again, I think when we ask primary teachers about secondary, you know, there's often a frustration that they get the kids all ready for secondary school and they send them off, and then all of that hard work is kind of thrown away because it's too chaotic in the secondary school and the behaviour does seem to drop off between the two. A good example on this is assemblies. We asked about assemblies in school and behaviour and how many interventions were made. Primary teachers are harsh in assembly. Like, primary teachers are on it with behaviour. So this view that secondary teachers are the really strict ones simply isn't true. When you put two similar situations next to each other, it seemed that the primary teachers intervened much more, were much more likely to deal with things and stay on top of it. So I can see how, from their perspective, if kids get to secondary school and start misbehaving, they may feel it's because actually things are not as strict as they were back in primary.
It's a rite of passage as a primary teacher to walk into the middle of your assembly row and escort the miscreant to come and sit your feet at the edge.
I mean, I don't know if that would work in secondary. Tom, I mean, you're in secondary. What do you do?
Come to the end of the line. Yeah,
it is a thing. I mean, I've had to learn that over the years, and I've worked with other people, like, you know, someone who's doing their first few assemblies. It's pretty intimidating. You've got to hold attention, and then there's a sort of weird thing of, do I really stop now in the middle of my great sort of motivational talk because it feels like I'm spoiling my message? And other people have absolutely no truck with it whatsoever. It's just like, hang on a minute, can we just stop and sort you lot out? And I think primary assemblies, you know, they tend to be a bit smaller, and I think that there's an intimacy there. There's something about... Are
they smaller? Because they're often whole school, whereas you don't get them whole school in secondary.
Oh, I don't know. It depends what you're thinking of. I'm sort of thinking like a year 7 assembly where there's 200 year 7s, and that can feel quite big. And then
you see, on my whole school assembly, when I did a whole school assembly, it was 375 kids.
Yeah,
admittedly very small at the front, but you know, but it's like a different setup, because the teachers would be sitting at the side, and if anybody was getting a bit fussy or fidgety, they would go into the middle and gently kind of steer them to come and sit at the edge. So there's much more, like you say, intervention at primary, but they are big events. If you've got a big primary school of 500 kids, you've got 500 kids in your assembly.
That's true. It depends on the scale. But also, I feel like in primary, there's this sort of feeling of like we're all in, you know, the teaching assistants, the teaching when you have assemblies. And in secondary, there's still often people are feeling...
Well, not necessarily, because this is also something I only learned recently.
I'm talking rubbish again.
But this happens all the time, right? Like I only learned recently, and I think we might have a question coming up about this, is that quite a lot of head teachers in primary school run whole school assemblies on their own to give planning time to members of staff. So wow. Actually, yeah.
I loved a solo gig. I lived for the solo gig. And that's when, obviously, a lot of the time as well, teachers would do their handovers with their teaching assistants, or they would have planning time, or they would go, because the good thing in primary is you have to flip your classroom. So you don't, the children don't move around the schools from specialist area to specialist area. So a lot of the time in primary, assembly time is when you flip your classroom from being your maths room to being your art room. So sometimes you're all in for the kind of big familial, you know, everybody together. And sometimes it is just a solo performance with the head teacher.
And that's what, again, this is what's great about Teacher Tapp, especially the weekly blogs results, because we try and mix in some things from primary, some things from secondary to get everybody just learning what are snippets, right? I will never fully understand what it's like to be a primary teacher because I haven't been one, but 2 or 3 little results each week or little stats that just remind me that there are other people in the profession doing a job that we all love, but is a little bit different. It makes such a difference. And I think that's why so many people are on there every single day. They don't want to miss out on learning what it is today that we're going to learn.
No, it's amazing. It's funny though, because I feel like, you know, there are some things which are common, because in my work now, I work probably 50-50 across primary and secondary. And so, and like tomorrow I'm doing a training day all day in a primary school. And yesterday I was in a secondary school all day. But we are still talking about similar things. We're still talking about, you know, explaining things, modeling, reading, and all sorts of things are common. And so I do love that about the profession. I sort of wish people more people had the opportunity I have to see it as a whole system rather than their own little silo of it. And you have this incredible kind of window on it. Now, I want to ask you a couple of other things about this, because what I want to know is a bit about the kind of trajectory, because I'm really aware that I keep on hearing like so and so has joined Teacher Tapp and the team's growing. So you must be getting more people, I guess, paying in to sort of fund questions, because it must be able to support this growing staff. So where's it heading? I mean, are you trying to branch out into other fields, or are you just getting the education sector bigger? What's your kind of pathway?
Sure. So one of the things people don't necessarily know in the UK is we actually have Teacher Tapp Netherlands and Teacher Tapp Flanders. So we have 2 international panels. We did have Parent Ping for a couple of years while the pandemic was on. So we built the staff out for that. But now what we're doing, so Parent Ping, we stopped after schools kind of went back after the second lockdown, and we've done all of the research for that. But now what we're doing is we've always been very interested in how do you get this information and you pass it to decision makers so that they can make really good decisions about education. And Harry Fletcher Wood, who I've known for a long time, actually from back on the Teach First days, I remember meeting Harry when he was a trainee, like on his actual Summer Institute training. And he gave us a really good challenge, which was, well, who makes most of the decisions in education? Where is the real power? It's on the ground in schools. And so over the past 6 months, we've been building a pilot. We've now got 19 schools signed up of school surveys. So this is where school leaders are actually able to ask their staff a series of questions like we've asked on Teach Tapp, and find out how similar or different their school is to the national panel and also to schools similar to them. And we're doing this because we think that there are some things that, you know, you need to know whether or not to hit the panic button, right? You need to know if X percentage of your staff are thinking of leaving, is that a problem? Or actually, is that completely normal? Because you'll see these surveys all the time that say, you know, 60% of teachers are thinking of leaving. But actually, if they've been thinking that in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, and we can see they all think that all across the country, and we haven't had 60% of teachers leave within 2 years, then it probably isn't a good thing. And we should try and address it, but it probably isn't worth spending lots of your time panicking about. So school surveys is really exciting for us. And it's a way of schools being able to use lots of that information to get a customizable service where they can pick the questions that they want to ask. So we've got school leaders, if anyone's interested in that, I don't know if you have show notes or whatever else, but people can get in touch about that one, because yeah, we'd love to sign more schools up to that service if possible. And then we just want to carry on doing a really, really good job of making sure that the community gets out to people. And I do need to give a bit of a shout out as well to Twinkle Hive. So Twinkle, the education publisher, they have a group that helps startups called Twinkle Hive. And so we are a partner of theirs. We're in their Twinkle Hive. And so they're helping us grow and develop as well. So that's another way that we've been able to fund our growth. Wow, it's amazing. I mean, that sounds good. I mean, I used to be kind of found surveys problematic, because I used to say that, so for example, you know, if one kid tells you they're being bullied, it's bad and you want to deal with it and you want to know about it. But if you do a survey of kids and you say, you know, what's the bullying situation, and you get a survey which says,
92% of children are happy with the behavior and they feel safe and happy, you're thinking, who are the 8%? I don't even know who they are. Who are the 8% of my kids who are not happy? I don't know which ones they are. I can't action that. It becomes a sort of a nagging, sort of unactionable piece of information. So surveys, which sometimes surveys are sort of, I don't know, I mean, you don't know what to do with them. So what's your view of that?
Yeah, and that's one of the things we've been trying to tackle. An example, because Harry's been working on this now. So Harry came and joined us and he's leading on it and is working on it. And one of the things he worked with recently was a school who kept saying, our staff are saying they're really busy, but we can't work out what is it in their workload that they're doing. So they asked a series of questions around planning, and they asked a series of questions around marking. And then they discovered that they just had a lot more meetings than the average school. So if they're able to cut back on meetings, that's something that feels like trapped time to people, of course. It feels, if you're not joining in and you can't go and do something else, and in your brain, you're thinking about those 53 things you've got to do, you've got a trip to organise, you've got extracurricular activities, you've got mock exams to do, and it really does stress people out. So that's like an actionable and it's an actionable thing that you can do. And there are also open-ended questions so that people can write in their suggestions about what should happen within the school. Again, as a school leader, you can't do everything. I know this as a business leader, right? I think every day about 53 things we could do to improve, and I can't do them all. And people will write to us all the time and say things they don't like about Teacher Tapp. And I'd love to solve every single one of those problems, but I can't. So sometimes what these surveys help you do is prioritize. In that case, of course, you want to know who those 8% of children are. But what you can do is communicate back to your staff, look, there are 8% of kids. We need to keep our eye out. What is our bullying policy? Is there one thing perhaps we could do which might help us discover, half of those kids? Let's try and implement that. And then because it's not outrageously high compared to a national average, we're not going to worry about it again this year unless it comes up. I think that would be a sensible approach to take. So that's again what we're trying to do with the surveys as much as possible. And Harry is having lots of conversations with the people who are in that pilot group and the people who are looking to sign up to see how we can make it more useful.
That sounds great. I mean, I can see this going well. So are you going to carry on, Emma, tapping?
Yeah, I'm locked out since I changed my phone. I've managed to get locked out of my Google Drive, WeTransfer, and Teacher Tapp.
If I'm being said, if Teacher Tapp's in the same sentence there as Google, I'm going to take that as a massive compliment. But if we can solve that for you, Emma, please do.
I'm just a massive Luddite. Everything I touch that's technology breaks. I don't know. Sort of massive magnetic static aura or something.
Well, please do send us a DM and we will look into that for you.
Oh, thank you.
I thought it was great how you were sort of like sticking up for the guy who invented Wordle, because you're sort of saying, look, if he was getting as many sort of issues as we do, I'd sell to the New York Times any day.
Well, it's the streaks, right? Because what I could see with Wordle from the very beginning was there was no mechanism for those streaks to be saved, because you don't log into Wordle. If you change your phone or something happens to your system, you're going to lose your streak. And once that starts happening, I knew he was going to get loads of people writing to him, because that's what happened to us. We had streaks before we had logins. And then you have no idea how difficult it is to move something behind the login. We had to do that about 18 months ago. And I think we lost something like 20% of users when we did it, because it's extraordinarily technically difficult. And the team did really well to only lose that many people. And these are not issues I thought I was ever going to have, hence me not being a tech bro, right? I honestly just thought I'd be a teacher forever. How I ended up as a journalist and a tech bro is still beyond me, but I do it because it helps in new ways. And we just want to come up with more and more interesting ways of getting good information into the hands of teachers, however that might work. And Teacher Tapp at the moment is the best vehicle for doing that. I hope it will carry on for a long time, and also that we can find new and better ways. So if there's things we should be doing, features that people want to see, new ways we could get information out, do get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm pretty much always there, as you both know.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we have to wrap things up now. But I just want to say, for me, I'm coming up to sort of 10 years since I started blogging and things, and it's sort of that 10 years overlaps with your time. And I remember you were one of the first people I ever followed on Twitter. There's sort of this nerdy person behind a kind of avatar of you, doing sort of tweets about the Education Select Committee, which I'd never taken any interest in before until you started reporting on it constantly. And then the Schools Week was just magnificent, and it still is, and I read it every week, and it's like, I feel that's a legacy of yours, even though other people now edit it and so on. But and so this is a new, I just find it so exciting, and you're also such a great champion of teachers generally, and teacher, you know, right from the teach first thing. And I think it's great. I love it that you have this sort of slightly quirky outsider perspective, you know, and I think it's so important to keep bringing that, reminding people that, hey, you know, not everyone went straight to teaching, not everyone did this, and I think that's great. So I'm a massive fan, and I really think it's been so exciting to talk to you. It's the energy you have, the enthusiasm is so infectious. It's brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Would it? Am I able to still add something, or am I?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go on.
I just want to say as well that it's not just me. I do want to just remind that my co-founder is Becky as well, Becky Allen, and whose idea it was. So just because I haven't mentioned her in this podcast, and I pretty much always do, I do just want to point out as well. Yeah, I've been very lucky with the opportunities I've been given, and one of them was to work with Becky on this. So
well, it's funny
to her too.
We started talking about Harry and Becky. Obviously, I mean, we'll have to get Becky. We'll have to get the professor onto our podcast.
She's way better than me. Get her on, yeah.
Yeah,
no, really.
the kind of nerdy geek out you must have together must be just off the scale. With Harry as well. It must be amazing to sit with you guys talking in the Teacher Tapp room. Well, look, thank you, Laura. I have to finish there. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks you to everyone listening and watching our podcast. We're always blown away by the fact that people read. In fact, yesterday I met a woman in a school, and she said, "I listened to your podcast." And I was thinking, oh, it's amazing. She really, so people listen. It's so exciting when people actually engage with it. So thank you so much, and we'll be back again soon. We've got some great guests coming up. Thanks again to Laura, and goodbye from me, Tom, and Emma. Thank you for listening. Mind the Gap.
Thank you.